Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 17th or 18th. It might be the 17th. And we will be hearing the presentation, Sustainable Transportation. What is it? For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, type those in the chat box located in your webinar toolbar, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division, so thanks to them, and you can learn about them at planning.org/divisions. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. From there, you can search for CM activities by typing in the event number or the title of today's webcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts available for distance education. Just check out our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook Planning Webcast Series to receive up-to-date information on our upcoming sessions. And we are recording this webcast. It will be available at the conclusion of today's session on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast. And we'll also have a PDF available at the end of the session. Again, just head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, with that, I am going to get us started and turn it over to Ed McCormick, who is our first presenter, and he's going to kick everything off. Ed.
Hi, thanks. Let me get my screen going here, and I need to swap. Hey, I'm Ed McCormick. I'm the director of the Master's Sustainable Transportation Program at the University of Washington. And so we're going to be talking about sustainable transportation and look at some examples from Norway. I'd like to thank the APA for sponsoring this, and particularly like to thank Eric Howell, who's on the executive committee in Ohio, for helping set up and arrange this. And looks like a really great turnout for a Friday in August, so I appreciate everybody being here. So here's the agenda, and we're going to do a little bit of introductions. I'm going to talk on a high level about why sustainable transportation, a little bit about our master's program here at the University of Washington. Ryan Avery is going to give an overview of sustainable transportation, and I'm going to talk about sort of the sustainable transportation in one of the more sustainable countries in the world, which is Norway, and then we'll have questions at the end. So as I indicated, I'm Ed McCormack. I'm a professor at UW, University of Washington, Civil Environmental Engineering. I direct a master's program in sustainable transportation, and maybe most relevant for this seminar is I've been a senior engineer for the Norwegian Public Road Administration, who's kind of analogous to the a state DOT or a national DOT. And then Ryan, who will be talking shortly, is a senior transportation planner at WSP, who used to be called Parsons Bringerhoff. And he teaches here at the University of Washington as an affiliate professor, and he's a civil engineer by training. So let me talk about why sustainable transportation at a fairly high level. And I want to address why we have a program of sustainable transportation. You know, probably being planners, you probably know that transportation impacts climate change. You know, transportation produces greenhouse gas. Transportation has impacts on human health, both in terms of externalities and also active transportation. Transportation uses energy, uses resources. There's transportation obviously has mobility and social justice impacts. And clearly, you know, transportation has a big impact on the economy. People go to work. E-commerce is becoming much more common as people order things through Amazon to be there in 2 hours. And so transportation has a pretty complex relationships of all these societal considerations, but you can also use transportation to make change and modify and impact all these considerations. For example, you could get people out of cars into non-motorized modes, which impacts health and air emissions and things like that. You can control travel demand management. Clearly, tolls and pricing modify how our transportation system is used and where people travel, what modes they travel on. Transit does the same thing. Let's get people out of cars into public transit, and impacts congestion, air pollution, quite a few sort of relevant elements like that. And increasingly in the transportation profession, we're talking about autonomous connected vehicles. They're going to change how our transportation system impacts our world, and we need to look at that. And being planners, you probably know that land use impacts transportation, transportation impacts land use, and that's why we have things like transit-oriented development, where we try and get people out of cars into transportation. There's an endless number of sort of linkages between transportation and our societies. And we've recognized that, and we have come up with a program here at the University of Washington where we focus completely on sustainable transportation. And so we look at planning and policy and research and analysis, all focused on the different aspects of transportation. And so we explore sort of the growing concerns for transportation impacts across a lot of categories. We look at environmental issues, social issues, energy issues, economic issues, and we look at a number of tools to address the impact of transportation in our society. And it's an online program. It's designed for working professionals. It's sort of a part-time online format with 43 credits. And so it's an evening class, there's a live session, and then there's work outside of the live session. So it's designed for people with jobs who want to either learn new skills, or they're looking to get a new job, or just advance their career. And so it's 9 courses over 3 focus areas over 3 years. And so if you're interested, you can search on Sustainable Transportation UW, or there's the URL down there. So with that, I think I'll put Ryan up, and Ryan can give you a little bit more detailed overview of what sustainable transportation involves. So I'll change to Ryan, and he can maybe introduce himself too. Okay, there you go, Ryan.
Great, thank you, Ed. You all can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. Make sure I unmute myself. All right, hi, my name is Ryan Avery. I'm a transportation planner, engineer by training, and I've been teaching in the Sustainable Transportation program at the University of Washington for 9 years now. I teach the introductory course in sustainable transportation, which is sustainable transportation planning, which is a really fun course to teach. It is sort of your typical planning course, but then it also covers everything from sort of a sustainable perspective of the sort of normal way that planning used to be done, and how sustainability is taking a bigger focus of that. And planners are pretty forward thinking, so planning has already been changing to reflect a lot of this, which is great. The image here is from the Caravan in Stockholm, because I spent 2 years living there in Sweden. We have all these great Nordic examples in our slides because I've spent time in Sweden and Ed has spent time in Norway, but I'll show a few pictures from somewhere else as well. So why does sustainability matter? Well, right off the bat, I start here. You're not meant to be able to read the small text. If you zoom in, you could. But this is a chart from the World Wildlife Fund, their Living Planet report. This is the 2006 version of their report. They have more recent versions, but they switched to a map-based view. And I actually like this chart because it sort of highlights the problem a little bit better in my mind. And what you have here is you have a chart along the x-axis. You have the Human Development Index. So 0 is really low development sort of subsistence, and 1 is perfectly developed, very modern economies like what many of the countries in the Western world have. And then along the y-axis, you have the ecological footprint. So it's how many global hectares of land the average person from each country consumes. And then these little bubbles here, these are individual countries, and they're colored by continent, and their size represents relative population. And so you can see the USA sits right up there at the top. In more recent versions, more recent data, sometimes it's a fight between us and a couple countries in the Middle East in terms of which one's at the top. But the general trend, even though this chart is, the latest version was 2016, but that, like I said, that was a map-based view. General trend hasn't changed. The U.S. we're pretty high up there. We're around 9. Things have gotten a a little bit better in some countries, a little worse in others. And so what this chart means to show is that dashed line at the bottom, that's the average biocapacity available per person. That's in terms of everything you do, the food you eat, particularly if it's meat, how much travel you do, carbon emissions, all this. And it's around 1.8 to 1.9 hectares per person. And so if every country in the world aspires to be like us in the United States, we have a real problem, because we already have a problem. And so that quadrant in the corner there that says sustainability quadrant, that is the quadrant of sustainability, and that's sort of where we want to be, where you want high development, the creature comforts of modern life. We're not going to, go back to, most people would revolt if we did, go back to no driving at all, and you can't use any energy and anything like that. If we don't have to soon, some of those choices might be made for us. But it's a high level of development, but also using drastically less land than what we use right now. So this next slide shows.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. Are there people in the background where you are?
Not really. Is it picking up a lot of background noise?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of folks are typing in that they can hear people in the background. I know you're in a hotel, so it might be difficult, but I don't know if you can shush them or if you know who they are, if you're able to get them to walk away. That would be helpful. So folks, we're aware. Thank you.
Yeah, I sort of picked a corner. Let me see here if I can move real quick to a different table. So I'll just keep talking on this slide here while I'm moving. So this next slide here is a chart from the Envision Guidance Manual. And it shows, it's sort of the same concept as the previous slide, where the point is trying to demonstrate the directions that we can move. And we obviously want to maintain a high quality standard of living. So on the x-axis you have quality of life, and on the y-axis you have the environmental footprint. And the arrow there is pointing to the direction we want it to move in, because what we're finding is, if you make our environmental footprint better, but you actually lower the quality of life, it's considered sacrificing. And that may be necessary, but right now what we really like to do is we'd like to keep our quality of life, but decrease our footprint and make the environment better. So we want to sort of move down in that lower right quadrant. Hopefully that's a bit better for noise.
I know you can't really help it, but we're still getting folks typing in. Our speaker is in a hotel, not by choice. So if you could just try to work with us, he's trying to move around and make it a little quieter.
Here, we'll try this. See if this works better. I don't know if this is any better.
So far, so good. Thanks, Ryan. Sorry.
Okay, it's probably my headphones pick up too much, so maybe this would be better. Hey, okay, we'll go with this. Sorry, all. I'm traveling in Toronto, so. Okay, so why sustainable transportation? So we talked a bit about sustainability, and sort of the point was that there's changes that need to be made, but we'd like to make them while improving our quality of life rather than sacrificing. And right now we're at a point where, again, much of the world is, much of the developing world is aiming to become more like the Western world. China and India in particular have developed very rapidly over the last 25 years. Their economies have grown immensely, but they are also now beginning to live much lifestyles that lead to a lot more consumption than they used to, and they're beginning to consume more on a Western standard than what they did before. And you see this here, this image, the background here is an image of Beijing traffic. It's nice and smoggy, can't see very far. And this is just highlighting one of the major issues which people here, of course, are very familiar with, and that's that transportation accounts for a large portion of our energy use and our carbon emissions. In the Northwest, where the University of Washington is, we're very fortunate to have very green energy sources. A lot of our power comes from hydro, which is great, but then that means that the vast majority of our carbon emissions comes from transportation. Transportation and building heating are basically the two major sources. So, and I'll highlight one thing. I'll come back to a little bit later. But even if we switch to electric vehicles, it's a shift. But the electric vehicles, that electricity is still generated somewhere. And so if that electricity is generated by hydro, that's one thing. But if that electricity is generated by coal, then you've just sort of moved the tailpipe of emissions to the factory. There could be some economies of scale in terms of cleaning, that sort of thing. But it still doesn't necessarily solve the problem just by having electric vehicles in itself. We also have to have green power. Urbanization is continuing worldwide. More and more people are moving to the cities, and that's posing challenges for cities as they grow. But this also poses an opportunity, because with that urbanization comes density, and density provides for some economies of scale where then, urban transport and those sorts of things are more feasible, as long as you develop and have the right sort of incentives to make sure that you're building, sustainable type systems rather than expanding the amount of vehicles driving and this sort of thing. So Ed already mentioned the feedback loop a little bit between land use and transportation, and that's a major component that, of course, planning is very focused on. Sort of thinking about how we design for things, how we plan for things, how people get from point A to point B, which is the big point of transportation. And here you have an image, many of you have probably seen this before. Connectivity is a big issue, and how you provide that connectivity has profound implications on how people move themselves. And so in this very simple example, if you live in a neighborhood and you have sort of the suburban cul-de-sac type concept with a few collector streets that head out to the main arterials without any passageways, it can take some time for somebody to go from that house to the school in the upper right-hand corner. Whereas if you have more of a grid street network or some actual connectors that allow for bikes and pedestrians to walk through, it's a much more direct path. And so somebody on that left side of the image, they're probably more likely maybe to drive and drop their kid off at the school, whereas on the right-hand side, that kid can probably walk. Maybe you can walk them to the school. You might even trust them to walk themselves. And so we as planners know that these kinds of things make a huge difference, but we need to look at encouraging more of the types of things on the right. And even where you have existing developments on the left, then maybe look at things as simple as getting access easements between properties to provide a sidewalk to have that direct connection. That's a very simple way that you can make things a lot better for a relatively small amount of money. This image provides an actual, sort of photographic example of it. Again, you sort of have that classic suburban development on the left, where houses take up large amounts of land. It's very auto-oriented, so everybody drives here. You just don't really have a choice. Even if you wanted to do something else, it might not be that feasible. Whereas on the right, you have a classic sort of transit-oriented development with, multi-story housing, some light rail, and so there's some real opportunity to change the way that people travel based on the land use. And so land use is really important, but of course it changes on a very slow time frame. And land use is not something that you can just change overnight. But as cities are redeveloping, and particularly some of the urban cores of American cities that had hollowed out in the previous century, there are some great opportunities to redevelop those. Of course, now the challenge is affordable housing. Living in Seattle, many of us are quite familiar with that. So that's obviously a conversation for another entire course, could discuss that topic. So what do we do? Well, as I mentioned, we have to change how we plan, design, build, and live. We have to change everything. And it's really, I think people are beginning to get their minds wrapped around it, but it's a lot more than just, window dressing. You have to really look at the entire process and try to, you can't just look at it and say, oh, well, let's try to add sustainability in here. You really have to sort of reframe the entire process from a sustainable mindset. And part of that is considering the life cycle costs and effects of things. So many times in the past, there have been incentives short-term things. Sometimes you didn't consider the full costs of things. If there was some funding from an outside source for something, you would just build a highway because the money was was there, and so you just sort of took advantage of it, even if it wasn't necessarily a project that was needed. We now live in a much more constrained fiscal environment, so those projects don't happen as often as they used to, which is a good thing. But still thinking about trying to make sure that you invest your money for the projects that actually have the most value. So doing cost benefit analyses that actually look at the fully burdened cost and life cycle investment. Obviously focusing on livability. Again, this goes back to land use and providing maybe some transit-oriented development, finding ways to allow people to live closer in, more compact housing density, which is it's a four-letter word in planning circles. In terms of trying to get people to accept it, people can support it, but getting it is much more difficult. Even looking at alternative energy sources, obviously, windmills, wind energy, solar energy are big. I was in upstate New York recently, though, and I just saw a lot of signs in the neighborhoods against some of the plans where apparently the governor wants to look at doing some windmills along Lake Ontario, and local population is not so keen on that because they think it's an eyesore. So there are always challenges, but looking at those kinds of different solutions the whole way through. And also not forgetting, again, Ed mentioned freight, delivery, Amazon, how we get our goods, even commercial goods, things like that. We can't forget about goods and freight because they do represent a large amount of the transportation that currently happens both on our street and on the rail system. Planning is already changing. As I mentioned, planners are very forward-thinking because they're always thinking, 20, 30 years in the future anyway. So planners have already been doing lots of the things that planners are doing this even some cases before sustainability was really becoming a hot topic. When Complete Streets was an important movement where people were really pushing to accommodate all modes and making sure that you were thinking about cyclists and pedestrians and not just vehicles. So there's much more of a walking and biking emphasis now these days. You're seeing cities and states across the country start doing bike plans where they're developing their networks and really trying to provide that connectivity, having really nice connections between all the facilities so people can actually make a full trip along nice, all ages type facilities. Demand management is always key. Still spend a lot of time thinking about that. That again is very much more policy oriented, and so it really depends on the political environment in the city or state that you're in. Pricing and tolling is obviously something that's going to be a larger and larger component. Washington State has done quite a bit of tolling as of late. Then you have, congestion tolling like in Stockholm, and I actually lived there when they first implemented that, and that was interesting to see. So, but pricing is a very important component, but very difficult because there's obviously a lot of resistance that's perceived as a new tax of sorts, but there's ways we're going to need to pay for the changes that we need to make. Transit-oriented development, again, mentioned several times, and finally, really focusing on resiliency. And resiliency is something that you're beginning to hear a lot in planning circles as we think about increased likelihood of natural disaster type events, whether it's the many forest fires that we have happening, particularly in the West right now, to the increased strength of storms that we have coming in on the East Coast, so increasing number of hurricanes and drought type events and these sorts of things. Planning has already been looking at this for a while now, looking at sea level rise, looking at how certain low level lands might be affected. And so really just continuing this trend and really pushing into thinking more about how we make sure that the future we are more resilient to not be as susceptible to the effects of climate change that are already happening and will continue to worsen in the short term because not enough is being done. One of the last things I wanted to comment on is that one of the frequent topics that comes up in my class as I teach it is technology. Can technology save us? And this is really interesting to me. I've done some work in connected vehicles, and I think it's a great technology for safety. There's a huge potential to reduce the number of people that are dying on our streets every year. I mean, it's still true that 40,000 Americans a year die on streets, and many of them pedestrians, and we can do better than that. And autonomous vehicles have great promise there. I'm a little bit less bullish on how, I don't think that it's going to be that rosy future world where we'll have electric automated vehicles zipping from point A to point B, and everybody will just wind up where they need to be. I think that policy plays a big part in this, and we have to think about what happens, because if we have everybody commuting to work and home in autonomous vehicles, and you're at work and your spouse calls you and says, oh, hey, can you do this for a minute? And you tell your vehicle that was scheduled to pick you up down on the street to just circle the block a few times. If you have 10% of the people in buildings doing that, you're going to create gridlock in the streets. And I still don't believe it's the most efficient form of transportation. It's great for first, last mile, but I don't think it's going to be the perfect solution that save everything. And in that same vein, Hyperloop, I just list these other things here. These are things that people use, and I almost think they mean well. We should still pursue some of them when they're actually feasible, but sometimes it distracts or sort of sucks the oxygen out of the room in terms of actually looking at things that, that people are sort of hanging their hat on and hope, oh, well, we don't have to worry about the climate because we'll have the Hyperloop in 3 years, and then we'll just be able to take that everywhere. And that's really not true. Same thing with air scrubbers. I mean, we might as well be expecting to have transporters in Star Trek. And even that wouldn't solve our problem, because then we would just have a huge energy crisis as everybody wants to zip from point A to point B. So, technology plays a role. It's definitely important, but technology is not a panacea, and we can't count on it. We still have to make changes. And that's why planning is so important, as we have to guide people into this and, sort of lead that change that we want to see over the next 20 to 30 years. So with that, I'm going to return it to Ed. This is just a picture of the, I believe it's the library in Masdar City when I worked there on the high-speed rail project back 7 years ago. It looks a bit like an armadillo, so I promised I'd have another picture from somewhere else. And really interesting initiative. We'll see where it goes. So with that, Ed, I'm going to return back to you.
Oh. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Like I said, let's go to Norway. Both Ryan and I are Scandophiles because we've been there a lot. And I've been fortunate over the last 30 years to have a number of positions in Norway, and then I come back to the United States. Like currently, I'm a professor at a Norwegian university, so I've spent quite a bit of time there, and I've been able to compare their system to our system. And so I'm going to talk about, going the wrong way there, talk about that. So I'm going to discuss why Norway is a sustainable transportation icon. I'm going to present a few examples that I think kind of make Norway unique. And I'm also going to speculate a little bit about kind of, their attitudes and their programs and why they value sustainability so much. But first, let me give you a high-level overview of Norway to kind of put things in context. They have a pretty high per capita income. They're number 5 in the world, and just by comparison, the USA is number 9. They're a major oil exporter, which is a big source of income, as well as fisheries and some other things. But unlike the United States, income's pretty evenly distributed. You can look at like the Gini index or some of those other indexes that show income distribution. So it's pretty much a middle-class country. It's what's known as a social welfare democracy. So they have universal health care, free college tuition, a very solid pension plan, very generous maternity and paternity benefits. You get a year off, that kind of thing. So they take pretty good care of their citizens. It's typically, when there's happiness surveys, they're often in the top ranks. Norway, Denmark, Sweden are often up in the top 5. And they're not officially part of the European Union, but they follow the EU mandates. They participate in the EU program, so they act like they're in the European Union, but they're not officially part of the European Union. And then I want to show, Ryan showed this slide, and you'll see Norway over there. And what I wanted to point out that is Norway is kind of a unique place in that it's ranked number 1 in human development. So it has kind of the good qualities, and it's fairly low on the ecology footprint index, and it's getting lower over time. So it's an interesting place in that, sort of from that aspect. So Norway, again, to put it a little more in context, has about the same population as Minnesota. It's about the same size as New Mexico, as many road miles as Wyoming, and the density is like Nevada. So it's not a big place. It has a lot of coastline, 16,000 miles of coastline, and it's a very rugged and a very mountainous and Arctic country. So half the country is in Arctic, which means in the winter, there's 24 hours darkness and there's a lot of snow. And just sort of their transportation budget's around $7 billion. So it's not a large place. And they have, considering that it's a very mountainous country, and that it's also, they have severe winters. That's, some point every part of the country has snow in it. So they have all the winter maintenance challenges and things like that. And many of the cities have old urban form. It's built around medieval cities, so they have narrow streets, and it's designed before vehicles. So you consider that it's mountainous, it's a high northern country with a lot of Arctic weather, and it has tight, constrained streets. It's actually in some ways pretty amazing how functional, how sustainable their transportation system is. It's a very green place. I mean, they have stated national goals that all new vehicles sold in the country are zero emissions by 2025. So, not too far out. They want no new passenger vehicle growth in their urban areas, and they're going to be trying to be carbon neutral by 2030. And this is partially by buying carbon offsets. And, most places have these goals. Most countries, you kind of look at them and well, say, yeah, maybe. But I think Norway stands a really good chance at making these goals. Now, this is an advanced society. It's a well-to-do place, and so they do have pretty high environmental impacts. And I think that partially drives their interest in being a green place, because they realize that they have consequences to being a fairly rich country, and they try and mitigate them. But the environmental policies, as you'll see as we go through this presentation, are pretty well integrated. And just to indicate kind of where they are, they have stable greenhouse gas emissions, even though the transportation volume has increased, the population's increased, and they can't really help. A big benefit to being a green place is that 99% of their power comes hydroelectric from dams, so it's a pretty clean power source, so that helps. So, you see Elon Musk was pretty excited that Norway is going to ban petrol-powered cars by 2025. And maybe one of the reasons he's excited is that they're the second largest Tesla market in the world. So, they're buying his cars. The first one is clearly the United States. Norway is, 6 million people. The United States is more than 300 million people, and there's a lot of Tesla cars. So as of last year, half of all the cars sold were alternative electric cars. So there are a lot of electric cars in Norway. They're quite common. And you can see some pictures down below I took of just electric cars all over Trondheim, Norway. So why are electric cars so common? Well, the reason is that there's national policy and regulations that make it less expensive to own an electric car than a gas or diesel vehicle. For one thing, you get a tax break to purchase an electric car. There's lots of tolls in Norway, and so you get free or no tolls on these toll systems. There's places you can charge your car for free. You get on the ferry, sometimes you get a lower reduced ferry fare. You get parking benefits. Sometimes there's taxi and bus lanes you get to drive in, and if you have an electric car. And gas is relatively expensive, and electricity is relatively cheap. So kind of all those things add up that if you are trying to buy a car in many ways, it's an easier decision to buy an electric car than a diesel or gasoline powered car. Another element that helps is there's lots of charging stations all over Norway, so you can reduce your range anxiety. And of course, a limitation of electric cars is that they only go 200, 300 miles. So if you're doing a long trip, that's a concern. And the Norwegians have thought about that, and they have some test corridors, green highways. There's one stretching, I think, 300 miles from Norway to Sweden. It's a fossil fuel corridor, and they're trying to get freight on it because freight's an important part of a transportation economy. And so there's a series of stations designed to recharge your car, and there's also renewable fuel stations. So this is kind of a conscious effort to address one of the limitations with electric cars, which is limited range. Now, another reason that makes electric cars feasible is they have a very steep vehicle tax, and they're, a fuel tax right off the bat. So gasoline, with all the taxes in it, is, if you go buy it, it's about $8 per gallon, which sort of, it makes a lot of the cars in Norway smaller just because gas is so expensive. But if you buy a standard fossil fuel car, there's a vehicle purchase tax, and it's tied to how big the car is. It's tied to the emissions. So if you have if you had an American muscle car, you'd pay quite a bit because it's a big, heavy car with a big engine. There's annual registration taxes, which are quite steep. And when you buy a car, you got to pay like a $400 or $500 scrap deposit tax. So when your car is ultimately sent to the wrecking yard and scrapped, that's covered. If you have a company car, you have to pay income tax on that. So kind of bottom line is this, that electric cars are not taxed near as much as gas or diesel cars. And it's sort of a nice side benefit is this, it contributes about $3 billion a year to the Treasury to support transportation projects and other projects. So let's go look at the National Transport Plan. This plan prioritizes resources and transportation. It's for the whole country. And it's a guide that's used. I know I've seen transportation plans that are not so well implemented, but this plan seems to be pretty well integrated into how the transportation system ultimately evolves, and part of it is because it's well funded. But right up in the front in the transportation plan, they say climate considerations are the basis of the work of transportation agencies. So they're very much focused on climate change, reducing greenhouse gas and things like that. So there's a lot of goals in this plan that address climate considerations. They're trying to have zero growth in car traffic, mainly in urban areas. It's a growing country. The population's increasing like most countries. So their urban areas are growing, but they want their growth, their transportation growth, to be in transit and non-motorized modes, not in cars. There's a relatively major investment in cycling. We'll talk about it in a minute. And, as Ryan indicated, freight's an important part of the transportation system, and they're trying very hard to move freight off trucks on the road onto sea, because, it's very much a coastal nation, and onto the rail network. And then they also have coordinated transportation planning with, between the national government, the cities, and the municipalities and local government. And the budget for land transport in this plan is about $7.3 billion a year. So in the National Transportation Plan, one of their stated goals is to cut greenhouse gases in the transportation sector by 50%. And they're going to continue to have incentives for zero and low emissions transport. The tax breaks, like I talked about. They're going to, if they have room, they're going to have priority for e-vehicles and low emissions vehicles in there for parking, because parking's often tight in Norwegian cities. And they have a program where they're going to put a lot more charging stations in to support longer trips to help address the problem with range anxiety. And they're going to have a significant increase in the use of sustainable biofuels research, and sort of stations and things like that. And they're going to continue and invest in their transit system. They already have a pretty robust transit system in most urban areas, and actually between urban areas. But there's going to be some investment in the transportation plan in bus rapid transit, more light rail in their cities. So one thing about Norway that's kind of unique is they have tolls are everywhere. They're very common in Norway. There's about 50 toll systems currently. Pretty much if you have a car in Norway, you have to have an electronic toll tag. And 50% of the annual construction budget comes from tolls. So tolls fund a lot of their transportation system. And the tolls are designed to cover the investment cost of the transportation facility, but they also have money that the tolls also cover transit use and non-motorized transportation. So if you put in a toll system that supports driving, there's also a number of alternatives to support non-motorized transportation or transit. And the tolls have a goal of reducing traffic and emissions. Clearly the higher the tolls go, the less people drive, and it's often a public-private partnership. So, some private company will work with the government to put in a system, and they'll get some benefit from it, profit. So clearly tolls are a policy tool that are very common in Norway. And just here's a map, to show all the toll systems in Norway. There are a lot of tolls between, for example, where I live, the trip to the airport from city center used to take about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. And now they put in a toll road and it takes about 25 minutes. So the tolls clearly made a better trip. So here's the tolls. A number of them are just better roadways, they're tunnels, that kind of thing. But there's also a number of toll rings around urban areas. And this is a policy and fiscal tool, again, with a non-motorized allocation to try and control travel in urban areas. And so there's, increasingly their de facto congestion management systems, but they have the sort of sustainable benefit of getting people out of the cars, making transit use and other uses more viable. But kind of, I wanted to talk a little bit about, why tolls are more common in Norway. And for one thing, as I indicated, it's a really rugged country. So anytime you put in a road, it's really expensive. So tolls are a way to sort of cover some of the costs. This tolls occurred maybe 15, 20 years ago, or they became more common. And both sides of the political equation agreed that action was needed. And when you get a toll, you get new transportation infrastructure. So if you pay a toll, there's clearly an improved trip. It's a better road, it's a quicker road. Tolls only last 15 years, so after 15 years, the toll stations come out. All the tolls use transponders, so there's no bottlenecks. There's no queues at toll stations. Toll roads, they're just higher quality. And the other thing is you can differentiate toll rates for zero emissions vehicles, so you can support the transportation policies that the country's interested in. And there's a little bit more of a pay for your impacts ethic in Europe and in Norway. So, if you drive on a road, you should pay for the road. It's not so much the case maybe in the United States. And let's talk a little bit about non-motorized transit or travel in Norway. So about 25% of all trips are on foot. It's a big walking culture. They do a lot of hiking too on weekends. Everything's closed on Sunday, so people go out hiking. You can't buy anything but gasoline on Sunday. And 5% of all trips are on bikes. The USA is 12%, but this number may seem low, but you're going to realize this is a northern country with a lot of snow, cold winter weather, and there's still a pretty high level of bike rates. Most Norwegian towns have bicycle and pedestrian facilities. This picture down here, I clipped out of Google. I just went almost randomly and picked a small Norwegian town of 1,000 people, and sure enough, they have a bike and pedestrian route. In some of these towns in the winter, some of these routes turn into cross-country ski courses, but a lot of times they plow them. And it's a pretty safe place to be a pedestrian or a bicyclist. The pedestrian rate's about two fatalities per million people. So the drivers are pretty cognizant of the fact there's lots of bicyclists and a lot of pedestrians, particularly in the urban areas. There's a pretty extensive bike and pedestrian infrastructure. The picture on the top there is in Trondheim, and it's in a bicycle lift. The town's kind of on 2 levels, and you can ride this elevator up to get your bicycle from the lower level to the upper level. Bike share systems like you see here are fairly common. The biking and walking infrastructure is typically pretty well designed and pretty pleasant to use. It's not just a paved path out in the field. And like I said, most urban areas have some sort of infrastructure. And what really kind of surprised me when I lived there is that people bike all year round. You can see this bike share station right next to it is a bike path, which has been plowed. People are riding bikes in conditions where I'm really fearful to walk. They just have studded bike tires. The other thing that I've noticed is that they don't have just isolated bike path. It's a bike network, and you can actually use the bike system to get to places. You don't have a bike path that stops and it starts up later. It's a network, and it's a pretty detailed network. So the National Transportation Plan has set aside almost $1 billion for pedestrian and bike infrastructure, and their goal is to get that 5% figure up to 10 to 20%. And right now what they're doing is they're prioritizing development of 10 bike express routes in 9 major cities. So these are high quality, broad, pretty wide separate facilities that are designed for fast travel, and functionally they're kind of commuter links between inner cities and outer suburbs. So they're designed for long distance travel on bikes to get to places. And so there's going to be 10 of these going in the next 10 years. And speaking of urban areas, fuel taxes and funding are the tools used, sort of highlighted in the National Transportation Plan, but used in sort of local and municipal governments to remove passenger cars. There's this thing called these urban environmental agreements, and there's 4.1 billion set aside, where the national government has agreements for local governments where their land use plans have to be designed to support zero growth of cars. So this is one of the ways they're going to get to this goal of no growth of passenger cars in urban areas. And so this also funds new transit services. I mentioned the bus rapid transit that's going in, and more light rail. There's already light rail in a couple of the cities, and more of it's going to go in. And if you're a city or the version of a county, and you're putting in a project that increases passenger car usage, you got to come up with some mitigation to reduce passenger cars someplace else. Another element that I think really supports sustainability that maybe people don't think about is that when I first was going to Norway, they had traffic signals just like we have in this country, but over the 30 years I've been going there, almost all the traffic signals are gone and they've been replaced with roundabouts. And roundabouts, make a lot of sense in many places. They're lower cost to put in. You don't have as much maintenance. You don't have to change light bulbs and things like that. And they clearly don't use as much energy. And typically they have better throughput and safety than intersections, signalized intersection. There's some minor issues with pedestrians walking around, but there's lower severity accidents. Another unique aspect of Norway, which really kind of caught me by surprise, is that they have tunnels everywhere. There's over 900 tunnels. And I'd go there with an older map and I'd be driving. I say, oh, we got a ferry route. No, wait a minute, it's the tunnel now. So they have these really long and deep tunnels that are, some of them go way under the ocean, 900 meters under sea. There's a tunnel up at the top picture that's almost 16 miles long, and that's not uncommon to have a 6 to 9 to 10 or 11-mile tunnel to get through some mountains. And they're busy adding 40 to 50 miles of tunnels per year. And they're also putting tunnels in a number of urban areas to get traffic off the streets and get it underneath the city. So some of the tunnels actually have roundabouts within the tunnel. So they have a pretty notable sustainable impact. Tunnels are clearly better in mountains. You have less climbing. You don't have to close the road because you haven't got the snow plows up there. You have less weather impact. Also, tunnels, if you replace a ferry, which you have to run back and forth and use fuel with the tunnel, there's less impact there. And like I indicated, that the tunnels are going in underneath the cities. For example, downtown Oslo, the city hall and the waterfront used to be separated by this multi-lane road, and they put a tunnel in. Now it's a very well-used pedestrian plaza, very, very pleasant because the road traffic is under the city. And they've done that in a number of other cities that I'm familiar with, where they've taken traffic along the waterfront and put in a tunnel and turn the waterfront into something that's more amenable to pedestrian and bicycle use. So just to sort of talk about, speculate why Norway is sustainable. And I think a big part of it is their social attitudes. They have kind of a history of equality and fairness. It's a very egalitarian society. If you work in a typical workplace, the person that runs the place and the lowest level employee, they typically get together and eat lunch together each day. And there's also a lot of history of cooperation among equals. Norway used to be a poor country, and so it was basically a lot of small farms in these steep fjords. So they had to be pretty independent because it was not easy to get any place. And so there's a sort of a culture of self-independence and sustainability. And it's also a really spectacular place. Here's just so I'm showing you some pictures through the presentation what it looks like, and there's a real concern about aesthetics and nature, and it's a very outdoors culture. There's a lot of hiking trails and boating and things like that, so they spend a lot of time outside. I think another reason is they have a little different planning attitude than we do in the United States. Let me try and explain what I think the differences are. In Norway, planning comes from the top down. So there's a social mandate, maybe from the EU or somebody else. We're going to have lower greenhouse gas emissions, or we're going to try and reduce congestion in urban areas. And so their planning efforts tend to come from the top. And the citizens of the country typically trust their governments to do the right thing, so they're much more willing to, pay tolls, give the government their data because they assume they're gonna be better off. In contrast, I think a lot of the planning in the United States is bottom up, and it's often driven by stakeholder concerns. So the planning agencies, get all the stakeholders involved. Each stakeholder has their own perspective, and I think there's a lot more individual programs, and clearly there's a lot more skepticism of government. So there's not a feeling that the government will necessarily do the right thing. So, Norway has these sort of global mandates, and they're trying to address them, and it gives the planning a little bit different flavor, and it makes sustainability maybe a little bit more feasible. So kind of in summary, I think why sustainability works in Norway is it's smaller, and it's a little bit more homogeneous society than like, lots of places. Citizens trust their government to do the right thing, so they're a lot more willing to let their government use the money for sustainability. And they're willing to spend their money to make life better, and having oil money helps. Though I always like to point out Norway has oil money, but Sweden and Denmark and Finland are pretty sustainable countries, and they don't have the oil money, and they still do a pretty good job of being sustainable. Environmental concerns are always on the agenda. If you're going to put in some sort of facility, a roadway or something, aesthetics are pretty high on the list, and there's almost always alternatives to the car built into that transportation project. But this country is also a major exporter of oil and user of energy, so I think there's a little bit of a guilt conflict because they're pushing oil out to the rest of the world, and they're creating greenhouse gases, and they're making the globe maybe a less sustainable place, so they're trying to compensate. But I think kind of the bottom line, from my perspective, is that it's a really gorgeous, beautiful, scenic country, and the citizens like their country, they're happy with it, they're interested in keeping it that way, and that's why there's a lot of support for sustainability. So with that, I think we can go to questions.
All right, great, thank you. And folks, again, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box located in your webinar toolbar, and if possible, maybe you could indicate who your question is for. That would help me out. Let's start with Ryan. There were a couple people who asked if you could talk a little bit more about what the Hyperloop is.
Sure. So the Hyperloop is, it's actually Elon Musk's idea. It's a idea that he's proposed in cities. Some places are apparently trying to do studies. It's a mass transit program, and from what I understand, imagine a very high-speed train in a pressurized tube or in a completely enclosed tube that can travel very quickly. The mechanics, the exact plans behind it are, there's supposedly plans out there. I haven't looked into it too much because I think it's mostly vapor and hype. But it's an attempt to build a very, very high-speed transit system. As I understand it, it would be little pod cars, so it wouldn't exactly be a train. So it's not like a high-speed rail or anything like that. It's more like little pod cars that would travel at speed. Although I'm not completely certain exactly what form it takes. As examples of how it's entered the conversation, I grew up in Colorado, and the I-70 corridor between Denver and the ski slopes can get quite congested, particularly in the winter. And there has been pushes off and on to look at doing some sort of transit along that corridor. And then a couple of years ago, somebody pitched the idea, hey, we should do a Hyperloop. And it sort of sucked the air out of the room, because then people are like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And there'd been a little bit of a genesis to do something else. And once that happened, again, nothing's really happening. And so it's sort of, I think it distracts people from the real, I don't know what his intentions are with it, but until I actually, he's promising that he can build this high capacity transit system that is super efficient and way cheaper than what governments can build it for. And I think that it's falling into the same trap that the monorail, the popular monorail project in Seattle fell victim to 10 years ago, which is that it always seems rosy and easy to say that governments don't know how to, build, and that there's always overruns. And then when you actually get involved in it, you find out that everything is more complicated than you thought. And so that's sort of my take on it. But that's why I threw Hyperloop in there. Is it's one of those projects that people throw out as saying, oh, that's going to solve our problems. People just be able to get from point A to point B. And it's going to be if it's high speed, it won't have that many stops. So it wouldn't really solve our problem. It's not a good mass transit system anyway. It's more of a vanity project for the rich.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Interesting. When Norway says that it wants to be carbon neutral, do they account for the carbon impacts of their imports from other countries, such as the US or China?
I don't think so. I think they're trying to be carbon neutral internally. But they're a fairly major exporter. I think at some point they're like the third largest export of oil, so they do have a pretty significant impact in other parts of the world, which gives them, I believe, a little bit of a guilt complex, which is also why they're trying to be so sustainable internally. So good question.
Great. And there, just so you know, there were some questions or comments about how, you know, they're wanting to be so sustainable, yet a major export is oil. So that did not go unnoticed with our,
That's right.
our viewers.
And it does not go unnoticed internally within Norway either. So.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Have electric scooters found their way to Norway? And if so, how have they impacted bikeways and sustainable travel?
There's a lot of electric bikes, and they my impression is they're just pretty well integrated. So you're starting to see people that don't look like bicyclists using electric scooters and electric bikes. I haven't seen very many of the little scooters because they don't. Bikes work okay on snow and ice. Those little electric scooters don't work, so they would only be used part of the year.
I was going to ask about that next.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. A timely question. Let's see here. In the light of the bridge crash in Italy, is Norway planning for infrastructure maintenance for all the tunnels, like the examples that you're showing? And do they have any money set aside for every mile of tunnel built? And
yes,
are they inspected, and by whom? And if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't. Some of the elements of the transportation plan I didn't go into is they have a pretty big section to fund technology, and they also have a pretty big program to do maintenance. The tunnels are pretty well sensorized. They have cameras and all sorts of, fire sensors and things like that. And there's control centers that watch the tunnel. So they're pretty careful about the safety of the tunnels. They're also designed to avoid traveler panic. They have different color lights, and they have pullouts where people can pull over if they get claustrophobic. So they've been doing tunnels for a long time, and they're pretty good at maintaining them. Some of the older tunnels I've noticed have had some problems with water seepage and leakage, and they're trying to deal with them. But I think they're pretty much experts on doing tunnels and maintaining them, so I don't drive into them, and I'm not very worried. The infrastructure is high quality. There's not much beat up infrastructure, so I've had very few concerns about maintenance failures and infrastructure failures. It's a pretty high quality transportation system.
All right, thank you. Next question. Why do the tolls only last 15 years?
Just policy. It makes it more acceptable too that you won't be having to pay a toll to get to the airport for the decades. That some way down the line that road's going to be a toll-free road. So I think it just makes the tolls more palatable.
Great. And no session would be complete without an equity question. So thanks for typing that in. For cities with hot real estate markets, can both of you speak, discuss equity, how equity is being meaningfully addressed to avoid displacement of existing low and moderate income residents? For example, the Oakland DOT is doing really interesting work with a huge equity focus. Do you know what cities are leading the way addressing TOD and equity?
Ryan, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, that's a tough question in Seattle right now because Seattle is becoming the second San Francisco. Some of you may be familiar with the outrageous house prices and have heard about that. And then, of course, we also have a very large homelessness crisis, and there's been a very big discussion about, there's a perception that many of the people that are homeless maybe were people that were priced out of the market but grew up here, and there's some debate as to, how true that is. But regardless, we have compound problems. We have a huge homelessness problem that needs to be addressed, and then at the same time, we have an affordability crisis where there just isn't any affordable housing. Seattle has actually been trying to do something. Like many cities, they've implemented incentives to developers to build some low-income housing, and then they get sort of incentives or credits for being able to do other things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. There's been a little bit of criticism because one, it's just not enough. I mean, we have way more need than there is supply. And two, there's a lot of programs for people who are very low income, but then there's sort of a big hole in the middle where if you have a reasonable job, say you're a school teacher or a firefighter or a police officer or something. And so you have income, but it's not a super high paying job. But you're above the thresholds that would qualify for low-income housing assistance. And so you're sort of left out in the cold, and people are moving farther and farther away from the city. And there's really nothing being done in the Seattle region that I'm aware of to address that big gap in the middle. And other cities, I'm not actually aware of. I mean, this is something I've been looking into off and on. I know that some cities have had better luck doing some programs related to this. A lot of it, there's some opportunities in the Rust Belt and places where populations used to be larger, and then they declined in the decline of the industrial sector in the later half of last century. And so they actually have the capacity in some of their systems and their networks to support some growth. So there's some opportunities there, whereas other cities on the West Coast that, Seattle is growing at a breakneck pace. It's limited. We have a lot of housing opening up this year. More apartments have opened up in the last couple of years than the last 50 years combined. There was a massive growth because they finally recognized that there really was a shortfall. That helped a little bit, but it really hasn't done anything about the affordability crisis. Now, we're seeing the same problems in, whether it's Portland, Denver, obviously San Francisco, New York City, obviously, they have some challenges, but with rent controls in New York, that's something that rent control is controversial, but it is a proven way to help people be able to stay where they are. And that wouldn't fly in a lot of places, but it still does help in New York. So, Ed, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, let me throw out a little bit of my perspective from Norway. I got to be a little careful here because I'm an engineer, not necessarily. I don't know so much about the social welfare system, but it is a social welfare democracy. So there's many fewer homeless people, and I also have noticed that equity concerns are kind of imbued in most transportation plans. So if, like I said, if you put in a toll, they're very careful to put in alternative ways to use. If you're going to put in a toll and make it more expensive to travel, there's also going to be bus service and a bike route sort of put in adjacent to that to make sure that people without the income to use the tolls can still get to where they want to go. So it's a smaller place. It's a more egalitarian place. There's a lot more social welfare resources. So there's just sort of a little bit less of an equity concern. I don't know. You hardly see any homeless people in Norway because there's funding to get them off the street. So there's a difference there. So.
Yeah, and actually I might add back to that, Ed, having lived in Sweden and been back to visit, I haven't been back in a few years, but Sweden, of course, is a very big social welfare state as well. And when I lived there 10 years ago, I didn't see very many homeless people at all. When I was back there 4 or 5 years ago, I was actually really surprised to see that there were people begging in front of most of the supermarkets that I saw, and they were almost universally East European. And so I don't know if that's a difference that in Sweden because Sweden is part of the EU. They're not part of the financial union, so they're not on the euro, but they are formally part of the European Union, and that makes it, possibly easier. They're more open to some border crossings and things like that. And so I know that that's something that Sweden has had to deal with. It was more noticeable, but I still am not aware of any high degree of homelessness in Sweden just because of the resources that they have, that they've dedicated to social welfare. But it was a change that I noticed from, 10, 13 years ago when I lived there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is there a major difference between the average miles driven per year per vehicle between Norway and the US?
I don't know if you've ever heard this saying that in Europe, 100 miles is a long way and 100 years is a short time. In the United States, 100 miles is a short distance and 100 years is a long time. So the trips are very much shorter in Europe. So yeah, there is. I don't know the statistics, but the trip, it's just a more compact place, so the trips tend to be a little lower. In Norway, I think there's one road where you could probably get up to 70 miles an hour outside of Oslo. And the rest of the country, it's just really slow travel because it's winding roads and the speed limit's not that high for safety reasons. So it's just hard to go a long distance. So yeah, there is a difference.
And since we're comparing, I guess let's compare auto ownership rates between Norway and the US. Do you have a handle on that?
Okay, this is just from personal experience. Most families tend to have two cars, or a lot of, well, okay, auto ownership rate I know is lower. So there's a lot of better alternatives. So, I know a lot of people have one car, but if they do have two cars, increasingly there's the bigger car that's a fossil fuel vehicle people use to go to their cabins, a longer distance, and they also have an electric car to tool around town. But yeah, car ownership rates are lower because there's just better alternatives for getting around.
Okay.
And I just looked real quick online, and the Norwegian National Travel Survey in 2014 showed that the average person took 3.26 trips per day. The average trip was 14.5 kilometers, and the average person traveled a total of 47.2 kilometers each day. So I guess I'd have to do the math real quick. And they don't specify. I think that's all modes.
Yeah.
So that isn't just driving, but I mean 47.2 kilometers times 365 days, and I don't know if that's a typical week work day or not, but yeah, we're talking 17,000 kilometers if that's every day of the year. So it's at least 2/3 or at least 60%, or I should say at least 33% less than the US. And if that's all modes, then it's even lower. It might only be 50% of what's done in the US. Because the average in the US is 15,000 miles per year.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I mean, I just from personal experience, I live in Seattle. I have 3 cars in my household. Norway, we didn't have a car. It was really easy to get around.
Yeah, and that was my experience in Sweden when my wife and I lived there. We didn't have a car. We lived there for 2 years, and it was great. So, yeah.
I just thought of something. You were mentioning something, and it clicked. In Norway, what do the work weeks and school weeks look like? Are they 5 days? Are they 4 days? Because that also can make a big difference, particularly with childcare and school buses, or our families, our work weeks and school weeks kind of synced up. How does all that look?
Well, so when I worked there for their version of the USDOT, my workday started at 8. We got together in the middle of the morning for coffee, and we had 45 minutes where we ate lunch. We went home at 3:30, and I had 7 or 8 weeks a year vacation. So they're not there as much, and the work days typically are shorter. A lot of places have winter hours. Like I worked in another place where we worked till 4 in the winter. In the summer we went home at 3:30, and most people in August nothing's around, so they have much lower work hours than here. And the other thing is there's daycares everywhere, and they're free, or they're low cost. So it's pretty easy to put your kid in a daycare until they go to school. And school's free, and college is free. So, there is some, if you have a family and kids, there is some juggling, but it's much simpler than typically is here. And I guess the other thing I noticed is that very young children, you'd see 5 or 6 year olds getting on the bus by themselves, at least where I lived. So, at some point there's a greater, quicker level of transportation independence, which sort of takes a little bit of the burden off the parents too. So it's very different there. Much more emphasis on work-life balance.
Sure. And there were a couple of folks actually that commented about the social side of sustainability and how, the importance of it and how it does play a large role in other countries. And there was one person who made a comment. I heard you mention that Norwegians love their country and are very happy. Could this be an underlying issue in the US with moving sustainable transit forward, that people aren't perhaps as happy, or they have less trust in our government, which on some level is a loaded question, so you don't have to comment on that. But just that, that the point is just socially how people interact and, how lifestyles are makes a big impact.
Yeah, and Ryan can probably comment on this, but I think part of it is it's a small, homogeneous place where the government takes care of you, and it's a beautiful place. And so in some ways, what's not to like? And I do hear people complain that if you want to become Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, it's much harder to do in Norway. But that doesn't seem to bother a lot of people. So yeah, it's a little bit of a hard question to answer. I just my impression, having lived in Norway and talking to a lot of Norwegians, is they like the country, and it kind of fits what the surveys say. So I don't know if Ryan.
I'll pipe up as well. I mean, a similar experience when I lived in Sweden. They may be slightly more skeptical than the Norwegians are, but if they are, there's not very much at all. But there's a lot of trust in the government and doing the right thing, and so it's a lot easier for them to do things. Whereas here in the U.S., a lot of times, we've seen this many times, and it actually seems to be increasing with the current political climate. Just the sort of back and forth that we go to public meetings for small projects, and there's strident opposition to we're working on a bus rapid transit project south of Seattle, and some of my colleagues went to a public meeting down there, and there are people that's come up that are supportive, but the people who are opposed to converting 1 or 2 lanes of a 4-lane underutilized road into bus access lanes where it could still be used. They're BAT lanes, so bus and local access, and the opposition was amazing. And we're just seeing this all over the place, and it might be an indication of distrust or whatever, but it is remarkable the difference between the two, and when you encounter that, and there's nothing you can do when people have these views. You listen to them, you try to make sure that they're heard, but at the end of the day, fundamentally, you can't. It's hard to engage and actually try to do anything because nothing you do is right. They just don't want anything to happen.
Okay. Thank you. I forget which one of you spoke about it, but there was a discussion, either Norway or Sweden, for moving freight to rail from, I assume, from trucking, highways.
Yeah.
Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, that was me. So in Norway, and I think a lot of Europe, the rail system carries people, which forces a lot more freight onto the road. So there's actually more trucks on the road in at least Norway for sure than in the United States, where a lot of freight goes on the long mile-long trains across the country. So the Norwegians have recognized that, and they're going to try and make their rail network a little more robust so they can get some more trucks off the road. And also that being having 16,000 miles of coastline, there's not many places very far from the coast. They have a history of using coastal expresses to move stuff around before the road network is developed. And so they just recognize that's an opportunity to get trucks off the road and onto rail and onto ships. And so they're trying to do that. I should point out, as part of this, there's a peninsula in sort of southern Norway which sticks out 2 or 3 miles and forces a lot of ships to go out around this peninsula. The water is really rough and choppy. It's known as a hazardous spot. So they're going to solve that problem with the tunnel. They're going to make a tunnel through this thing called the Stad, this peninsula, which is going to be big enough for a cruise ship to go through. And most places I'd look at that and kind of laugh like, oh, great. Yeah, that's not likely. But I suspect as hell they'll make a tunnel big enough for a ship to go through, so it doesn't have to go around this peninsula. And that's part of that's in the transportation plan. That's part of the effort to make coastal shipping a little more feasible. So yeah, it seems like a reasonable plan.
Okay, thanks. Ryan, a couple people typed in a question similar to this. Can you expand on the concept of the potential value of autonomous vehicles for the first and last mile? And if you could talk a little bit about what the first and last mile concept is.
Sure. So one of the major problems with mass transit systems is that they really effectively work by collecting. People already have to be collected at the stations, and then they can ride the most effective forms of mass transit into the city. So whether it's sort of a commuter rail or light rail or high speed rail or anything like that, those stations are few and far between because obviously to be effective and efficient, you can't have too many stops. So then it's really important to have bus lines or other systems that connect to those stations. But then even as importantly as that, it's, if people live, even if they live close to the station, if they live, 1 or 2 miles away, a lot of people currently don't walk that far or bike that far. And I'm not sure whether it's a complete reluctance to do so, unawareness, or people are just used to driving. People are used to having free parking. A lot of people want parking lots at all the stations and things like that. And so using autonomous vehicles, or that's sort of the problem with the first and last mile is if you have somebody that lives relatively close to the station, but maybe a little bit further than they would feel comfortable walking, and maybe it's as simple as providing a bike lane or a nice protected bike facility and they would just bike it, but trying to find these ways to connect people to the station so that then they can ride transit, because that's what stops a lot of people from riding transit. Is if they lived right next to the station, maybe they do it, but because they live a little bit away, there's no place to park, and so they aren't thinking about walking or doing anything else, since they just sort of there's a loud thing going by me right here. Right, so now it's by. And so, it's hard and they just don't do it. And so by providing first and last mile solutions, you're making it easier for people to connect to transit. And autonomous vehicles can play a role there because that's a really good space to, it's something that's inefficient for transit vehicles because you're talking about short routes and maybe not that many people. But an autonomous vehicle could pick up a number of people, get them to the station, doesn't have to park, it could drop the person off and then go off and pick somebody else up at another nearby house. So that, in my mind, is actually one of the chief benefits where you're really using autonomous vehicles for what they would be really well designed for. Whereas trying to use autonomous vehicles to replace mass transit, to me, doesn't make sense because we just don't have that capacity on our roads today. And even with the efficiency gains of autonomous vehicles in terms of platooning them together more closely together, you're not going to increase the road capacity by that much. So I think they have a better role to play in those first and last mile solutions.
Thank you. How do Norwegian communities deal with the growth in e-commerce?
They already have a pretty robust locker system. So when I lived there, my packages did not come to my house. They came to my local grocery store, and there's lots of little grocery stores. So on my way home from work, I'd just stop by the grocery store, or later at night, I'd stop by the grocery store and get it. So in some ways, they have a pretty good system already. Lockers help e-commerce quite a bit. And I have noticed that they've been expanding their delivery systems, their version of the post office. And by the way, the postal vehicles are typically hybrid or natural gas powered, so just to fit with sustainability. But and like every other country, there are some concerns about trying to get packages from the truck into the office building or household, but the locker system helps. You know, we don't have near as a evolved locker system in this country as they do over there.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can both of you talk a little more about the link between sustainable transportation and air quality? While the tailpipe for electric vehicles may be moving from the road to the power plant for a renewable source, aren't electric vehicles providing a significant health-related benefit as no emissions for our cyclists and pedestrians?
Yeah, I'll take the first crack at that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if the choice was purely between having an electric fleet of vehicles but still having emissions at the power plants, if it had to be, say, something that's still polluted, I would still say that that's an improvement, just because you're moving to a way smaller number of point sources of pollution instead of having a bunch of non-point sources. Millions of vehicles out there polluting. Now you can find it to however many power plants there are, if everybody was electric. And then, of course, it gets even better if you have renewable forms of energy that are generating that electricity. So, yes, definitely, it still is better than the alternative of gasoline-powered vehicles. But I'd still like to highlight to people that it's an improvement, but electric vehicles don't fix all of our problems, because there's a pretty significant environmental cost for mining the lithium. The lithium right now is coming from countries that don't necessarily have the best safety standards, so workers sometimes are injured. And so there are still environmental costs that are associated with that, and there's been a huge demand in lithium because of electric vehicles and other things, and it's limited mostly to, I believe, some of it comes from China, and a lot of it, I think, comes from Venezuela, or it's somewhere in South America, and I'm trying to remember if it was Venezuela or Colombia. But so there still are environmental concerns with how you get it, but it's still better than where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, to really simply state it, in one of the classes we look at we assess the life cycle cost of a electric car on the East Coast, where a lot of the power comes from a coal-fired power plant, here in Washington, where a lot of the power comes from a dam, and there's a big difference. So, point source matters, as Ryan points out.
Okay, I think we'll do one last question, and we get this one every now and again when sustainable vehicles and the topic of electric vehicles come up. Do you have a sense of what the volume of energy usage is for petroleum-driven vehicles versus electric vehicles? It seems to me that plugging in a car uses as much energy as you would putting in several gallons of gas, plus the batteries from electric vehicles are increasing in trash. Can you talk a little bit about what the advantages of electric vehicles? Is the carbon footprint really lower than a gas-powered vehicle?
So, that's a question of energy efficiency. Ryan, do you have a handle on that?
I mean, I know that I haven't found a smoking gun report on this yet. I really am hoping that somebody really tackles this in a really sort of academic way and really investigates it, because it is a fair question. I mean, like I said, because there's a lot of caveats, like we mentioned, of course, if that energy is coming from, hydro or something like that, then it's obviously great. But if it's coming from coal, then yeah, there are questions, because in distribution systems, you have to build all those electric charging stations. But then, to be fair, you should also count the cost of, what it takes all the time to ship those tankers of gasoline over to the gas stations to fill their tanks so people can tank up. And at one point, those gas stations had to be built. So I don't know of anything off the top of my head, but I think it would be really interesting research to do a really deep life cycle analysis between the two. But again, where you are matters, because I think one of the biggest components will be where the energy source is for recharging.
And I'd like to sort of, you know, in our sustainable transportation program, we talk a fair amount about life cycle assessment or analysis because it's a much more complete way of looking at impacts. It's kind of cradle to grave. And I know the ENO Foundation has recently published some reports sort of supporting life cycle assessment for the transportation system. So, you know, if this is something you're interested in, I encourage you to look it up because it's just, you know, it's a much more thorough way of looking at impacts because you look at everything from the cost of the raw materials to go into a system to, you know, the externalities and the inputs as well as the cost to scrap a system. So it's just a more thorough way to look at it. And I think somebody would be, like Ryan said, it would be great to do a life cycle assessment of different kinds of you know, electric car and gas car and diesel car and hybrid car and things like that. And hopefully someday somebody will do that.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'd add to that real quick is that just crossed my mind too is it also depends on when, because 10 years ago when electric cars were brand new, the extraction costs and battery technology was quite different, and it was much more expensive to manufacture those batteries. But as vehicle production has increased, then you start to get economies of scale when there's larger orders, there's more people doing it, there's more competition, more people get in the game, and so the costs for extraction, I mean, like I said, there are environmental costs for getting lithium. Maybe we'll find better battery technologies in the near future, but it still is getting better than it was, but I don't know how it compares. So, if you did that study now, it would definitely look different than if it had been done 10 years ago.
All right. I think we're going to go ahead and close up shop. So Ed McCormick and Ryan Avery, thanks for joining us today and talking to us about this topic, and to the Transportation Planning Division for sponsoring today's webcast. Again, we're going to have this presentation. We'll have it as a PDF on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, and we'll also get a recording of this up on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. So again, Ed and Ryan, thank you so much. And everyone, hey, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.